Hello and welcome to A High Note. I'm here with a really talented composer and friend whom I've met and had the pleasure of playing wonderful music with over at Taxi. Hello and let me
welcome
just mute
to
this guy over
A
here
High
really
Note.
quick. I'm here with, sorry that happens. I'd like to, before we get started, I just want to give a special thanks to, well, here's my little roll in. Here we go. Welcome to the High Note podcast. And then I'm here with musician composer Julian Mateu. And that way you get his spelling and we're going to share. Do you have a website, by the way, Julian?
Yes, I do. Is
So we're going to put the
J?
website we're
Okay.
going to put the website in the comments. So you'll have that.
Right.
I want to throw out a special thanks to Piebox and Slack for sponsoring us, letting us use their tools here with the Composer Exchange to learn, collaborate, and communicate and have a good time. Um, if you're interested in joining our community on the Composer Exchange, jump over to composerexchange.com. I have a website there and just, jump into the forum and reach out to me and I'd be glad to connect you and we'll learn about you and what you're doing and how we can help each other in our journeys as composers. So without further meandering on my part, let's talk to Julian. Thank you for joining me here today.
Yeah. Hello, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Now, you and I met at Taxi, but
Yes.
we have an interesting connection in how our worlds have crossed paths because not only did we meet at Taxi and we had a great time playing music together, you have so many skills. You were playing drums and bass and guitar and piano and doing all kinds of stuff while we were there. And that was really impressive and interesting and fun. And we had a good bond. And then uh, part of how the Composer Exchange started was a group of us that were involved in Mark Giovanni's Composer Exchange community or cinematic composer community. Um, Started getting together and meeting weekly, and a lot of those folks had participated not only in his online courses but in his momentum program. And I'm
Yeah.
watching a video one day. I didn't know that you were involved in the momentum program. Watching a video that they took of the recording sessions, I went, wait, that's Julian. And so that was really cool how
Yeah.
our paths had crossed on that level as well. Tell me, let's kind of start. We're gonna kind of go through your journey in music and as a composer, but let's start with that, how you participated in that program. Where were you at in that part of your career that was a year or two ago at least, and how that kind of got you inspired and where you're at right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was the first half of 2022. And yeah, so I'm originally from Argentina and I moved to the UK in 2019. And back there, I used to have, a band and I was playing piano at the conservatory. And when I moved here, I didn't have instruments with me at that time. And then the COVID pandemic came. So I was like a little bit, didn't know what to do with music because I couldn't play with other people. So I started getting more into composing. And I first didn't know a lot about it, but I had some experience playing with the DAW, just trial and error. And at some point, I said, okay, I need to get better at mixing and learning to use the virtual libraries and all that. So I started, that path, and eventually I found Mark Giovanni and his cinematic composing group. So I think I bought one of their online courses first, and I
Mhm.
did it, and I thought it was really good, but I needed this more like practice and feedback with my music. And suddenly, like I was just thinking that, and I saw the ad for Momentum. I think I was part of the first group, the first cohort.
Mhm.
So yeah, I remember I saw the ad and I talked to Mark, and it was like, yeah, this is what I'm looking for. More accountability, somewhere to learn about how to use these music libraries and have kind of like these projects that I can do, weekly. So yeah, it sounded great, and I joined that, and I'm really happy that I did because I met a lot of amazing people like you and other people that are also in the composer exchange community. And yeah, I think it was for me a great experience as well, from learning and connecting to other people. So yeah.
And now, one of the things that you got out of that program, and I think he still has it as part of his program, but you actually, and this was what the video was that I saw you in, was it was capturing their sessions in LA, which you must have
Yeah.
gone to LA along with all the other folks. And I know a lot of people have traveled from far away
Yeah, yeah.
to participate, but you actually got to have your music performed by an orchestra as part of that. Tell
Yeah,
me
that
about that
was
experience.
yeah, that was an amazing experience actually, because again, I think there were many coincidences with this. I remember I saw someone on Instagram, conducting and play their own piece, and I said, that would be really cool. And I think that same week, Mark said, "Hey, I got the surprise for you, whatever," and he announced this thing of the recording session in LA, which wasn't originally part of the program. It was at that time, I think he said it's kind of like the gift, for the first cohort because we trusted him and all that. So he organized this recording session in LA, and yeah, it was travel there. I think we had the studio for 2 days, but it was only one day for recording, and we were like 20 something people, so it was couple minutes each to record. I think we had 8 minutes per person, so that means if you want to have like 3 takes, your piece has to be really short. uh, but yeah, it was an amazing experience because the studio was super cool. The musicians there were amazing. They could sight read whatever, and perfect in the first take. So first take sounded amazing, and then the other 2 takes were just polishing small details. So yeah, it was an amazing experience. And actually for me, I didn't have any experience conducting. So because I had this thought that this would be so cool, I said, okay, I'm going to write a very simple piece that's going to be easy for the musicians to read and everything, and easy for me to conduct, so there's no problem with that.
Yeah.
And then I took a couple of, I think, 2 lessons with a guy that's actually a violin player here in a Philharmonia Orchestra in London. So I
Mhm.
remember I looked online for like conducting lessons or something, and I found this guy and said, okay, I'm going to take 2 lessons just with my score to learn how to move my hands,
That's
so
really
that it
smart,
makes
though.
sense. Yeah, and then I
It's
went
a lot
there.
easier than it's a lot harder, I should say, than just going.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
you
yeah,
could
it is.
anybody could, that's kind of like the church thing. You can memorize that part, but really
Yeah,
connecting it with the music, there's a whole
yeah,
to that
yeah. And for
that
me, it
people
was
take for granted.
yeah, no, for me it was a great learning experience as well, because I told this teacher that I had, and I also think because in the recording session you already have the click, it's not so important for you to keep the tempo. It's more important to express the dynamics and all that.
Exactly, the expression
um,
that you want to get out of
yeah,
that.
so I really focused on that, and I
Mhm.
think it was
Wow.
a really nice experience for me to learn more about that. And I really felt that connection with the musicians as well. It was a very good experience for me because it's a very weird sensation, I think, because it's like you don't really have control over the music. It's not like when you are playing, it's like a level of indirection. You have to tell someone else what you want, and it's also you do it with gestures and face expressions and all this. So it's a really interesting experience. But yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. One of the funniest things I remember growing up in Minnesota, we'd go to the state fair. They have these fairs, and they show off the livestock and art and all kinds of stuff, and tons of food that you shouldn't eat. But one of the cool things that they have there is they'll have like the local orchestra perform. And one of the fun things that they love to do is take a guest up from the audience and they hand them the baton. And they're like, well, I don't know what to do. And the orchestra will go, wow. And then there's like, they'll go, no, 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 no. And then they'll go, da, 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 da. So whatever they're doing, they're responding
Yeah,
to this person who is just, and then the more that they screw up, the funnier it gets. It's just hilarious.
Yeah,
Really neat thing because, but you realize, the musicians are really tuned in to the conductors, and
yeah,
I've always appreciated that. I've been watching a few YouTube videos on various conductors, and it's kind of cool how, some of them are really, or they make these crazy face gestures and stuff like that, but wow, it expresses it tells the story of the music, and they really push that out there. It's really, really kind of neat.
yeah. It's amazing. I think at the beginning I used to wonder, like, what does the conductor actually do? Like, can't the musicians just play without the conductor? And yeah, it's very interesting what you see this, because they can, but it really makes a difference, when the conductor is really expressing a lot of these things. And I think it's yeah, I for me it was a great experience to actually learn that by being there. And yeah, apart from that, I think the recording itself was also a really good experience, because the studio was really nice. The recording engineer there was Bobby Fernandez, and he showed us like a lot of the things he did to set up the session and all that. And I don't know, I really enjoyed it. So yeah,
That's awesome. Now, did you do one of the processes that people go through is the orchestration? So it's one
yeah,
thing to usually you'll kind of play it in, you'll do an orchestral mock-up, you'll put your pieces into your DAW and you'll get that ready. Now,
yeah,
then you'll have to take that and translate that into a score. And coming from a DAW expression of what sounds good for your MIDI mock-up, it's not always, quantized and perfect. So you have to go through a process to kind of adjust your MIDI so that it will translate well into the scoring, or the writing out the parts and that sort of thing. The orchestration, they call it. I mean, there's kind of
yeah,
two levels of orchestration. There's the kind you do in your DAW in picking the instruments and that sort of thing, and then there's that orchestral translation of an orchestrator. Tell
yeah.
me about that process, because I think that's something that people will find interesting, about how that can, you did study at a conservatory, so you had some good training and a good understanding of music theory, at least in a pretty fundamental
Yeah,
sense. So how did that
yeah.
all work
So
for you?
yeah, so I studied in the conservatory, but I studied piano. And I got some things with composition and music theory and everything, but I never got to really study orchestration in depth, because the conservatory is very long. I think I did kind of like 8 years in time, but it was like six and something academic years, because I was working and doing other stuff in between. And then I moved here and I didn't finish it. So I did have a good understanding of theory and everything, but actually when I was in Momentum, I also started studying, more about orchestration itself and understanding, what the different instruments can do and how to notate for them and all that. In this particular case, because I already knew, so Mark told us about this recording session, and he said, you can either use one of your pieces or write a piece specifically for this. So I already knew what the ensemble was going to be, which was, I think, one violin, viola, cello, double bass, harp, and French horn. And the same player was doubling flute and clarinet, um, and the piano. So that was the setup. So I said, okay, I'm going to specifically write something for this. And I did it on paper from the beginning. So in this
Oh,
case, I
wow.
didn't do the mock-up first. Yeah, because I hadn't really done that much, but I said, okay, I'm also going to learn, more about orchestration and writing and everything with this, experience. So I decided to write it on paper from the beginning, which was a really nice experience as well. I recommend people, to try these different approaches, because I think for me, it's a completely different process when you're writing in the paper. It's more like you have to imagine a lot and also, decide what you want to write. Whereas if you are writing more in the door, at least I do, it's more about thinking from the sound first, if it makes sense, right? So I'm kind of like playing and listening, and that feedback loop is faster. So yeah, for me, it's a different process. So during the other exercises that we did in Momentum, I think it was one where we did also that whole process of translating something you write in the DAW to a score. And I think, as you mentioned, yeah, there are many tricky situations. Like if you just want to copy paste the MIDI, that's probably not going to work, because yeah, you usually have a lot of things like, I don't know, if you have key switches, or if your notes aren't perfectly quantized, or maybe, you know, they are instead of lasting, I don't know, 1 bar, they last 1 bar and a bit. So now
Yeah,
the software
exactly.
writes it,
Or
you
not
know,
even a
with
beat. Not, give
yeah,
you this little, 128th note or
yeah,
something.
exactly. So yeah, that's very annoying. So there are different processes to do that. I think one is you first edit the MIDI and you like quantize it and do that, and the other one is you just, you know, start transcribing or fixing the errors. I think for me, I don't usually use key switches, and I also have my DAW in a way that, for example, you know, some instruments have a delay, and some people select all the notes and move them a little bit to compensate for that delay. So when I built my template, I actually added effects to compensate for the delays, so that I know, you know, this library with this violin patch has, I don't know, 60 milliseconds of delay. So I add an effect there
Yeah,
to the
track
track.
delay.
Yeah,
Exactly.
so like to compensate minus 60 milliseconds. So then when I write the note exactly in the beat, it sounds there. So that's one, I think, cool tip to like when you export the MIDI, it will be, you know, better. But yeah, I think in the end, it's always a manual process. And at least for me, I didn't, I don't know all the details, you know, of like writing for people who are going to play it in a recording session. So there was a lot of review internal in Momentum. Like we had, you know, another teacher that was there and reviewed our scores and everything. And I also asked, you know, people that I know and everything to kind of get these reviews, which I think is also really good, because usually when you write, and you get a second pair of eyes looking at your work, you know, they can spot these little mistakes or maybe suggest things. So for example, one thing for me was, I think they suggested changing the octave of the flute, for example, and I tried that and I actually like that more. So, you know, these kind of details, I think it's
Well, especially, yeah, from that translation of like you're writing something, you're notating it while if you were listening from a DAW, you would pick what
yeah,
sounded the best for you. But when you're writing it out, you're not always in tune with that octave range that they're in.
yeah,
Because, like a bassoon and a contrabassoon, I think, if I remember correctly, they're written the same, right? But one is
yeah,
just an octave lower. The same thing with a cello and a double bass. A cello is an octave higher than the double bass, but you're writing the same notes. So
yeah.
keeping that in mind, those kinds of details are kind of tricky with that.
Yeah, and then there are always specific things to a recording session when they, for example, in this case, they told us, oh, the musicians want, you know, everything in C, you know, like with no
Concert C,
clef, so concert C. So if you're writing in, I don't know, G major, instead of using, you know, F sharp in the key signature, you would still write it as if it was in C, and add, you know,
with the
all the
accidental.
accidentals.
Yeah,
I
I've
think,
heard
you know,
that a lot too for folks.
yeah,
They'd rather see it all in C and then have the accidentals. Then there's no question. They don't have to
yeah,
kind of
exactly.
refer back to the key signature. Did we change our tonal center or those kinds of things? Yeah.
Yeah. And then they have some specific formats for the parts as well, where they want, I don't know, um, maximum, I think, 4 bars per line. And if you have long silences, you know, you want them at least, I think it was 8 bars. So if you have like 16, they wanted like 8 and 8, so that it's easier for them to count or find themselves if you know, they have to count for a really long rest there. And yeah, you know, a lot of these things, but I think also those are very different from session to session. So yeah, I think it was
I mean,
quite an experience for me, because I have never done that. And yeah,
one of the things, and I was a horrible concert percussionist. I just I pity the folks that had to suffer with me. But one of the challenges, they'd have some of these long pieces. They'd have a little
Yeah.
triangle part at this one section, then they have some timpani, and then they'd have another little snare drum thing. And so you'd see all these things. Maybe they'd be on one part, maybe they'd be separate parts, but there's like, 32 bars of rest, followed by
Yeah.
a bar of 2/4, and then a bar of 6/8, and then 12 bars of rest, and then 100. It's like you're
Yeah.
going, what, you're trying to count this.
Yeah, and I think for example, when you are doing something like this, that's why also conducting this is also important, because I think for you to give that cue to the musician is really helpful for them if it's a piece that they don't know, because usually if it's like a very well-known piece, they rehearse it so they also know what to listen to enter. But when it's they're looking at this for the first time, if you make them count, I don't know, 123 bars, it's really hard, right? So that's why I think knowing when each instrument is going to enter and all that, and giving that cue as a
That,
conductor is really
those are
important.
really good points. I don't want to deviate and tell my own stories here because this is your time. But one of the funniest things I learned, they don't like the idea of jazz with classical. So the conductor had one of those long counts, and the conductor had this part, and it was this big epic part in the music where it's boom, ba-da-ba-boom, and the timpanis. And I was, and it's like he pointed to me, and I had no freaking idea where I was. So I just improvised because he's like, he's making all the gestures, and then he's like, he knew I was improvising. So I stopped. I'm like, but I was like, yeah, that didn't go over too well. But
Yeah.
when you are listening and you're writing as a composer, you hear that it isn't necessarily as important that it's a specific lick. It's just it's a texture that has to build it up at that point. But anyway,
Yeah.
we
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think for me, some of these things are, I would say, limitations of our traditions, because I think we developed as musicians this notation system that's really good for some things, but maybe for other ones it's limited. And I think, as composers with the DAW, sometimes you do these things where, okay, this is more like an effect, right? So as you're saying, it's not really about, how many
specific things you're hitting, or
beats
you're
you
not
do.
hitting
It's
with
more
something.
about, yeah,
Yeah.
the color and everything. And I think, that's quite interesting point, because sometimes for you as a composer, it's like, okay, I don't care necessarily about which notes and which durations. I care more about this effect, but then I have to notate it, and I would have to do all this complicated translation for then the other person to understand what they need to play.
I want a marchy snare drum thing through here. And
Yeah.
then you got to think about what that is. Dot, ticka, that, brr, dot, bop. I mean, what are you going to, you got to have to invent the part,
Yeah.
but you hear it as a composer. I want that thing there. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah. But I
How
think,
did you,
sorry, yeah, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, how did you find, like, when you were getting back to your writing this out, and kind of that difference when you're working in a DAW, you're grabbing a particular patch, and then you might hear, okay, I want to have pizzicato for here, and I want to have a tremolo for here, and that sort of thing. When you're playing it live, as you were talking about playing it, you're going to play that, and you're going to switch back and forth really quick over, say, maybe even 2 or 3 bars. You might use all those articulations. But within a DAW, it's really easy to get kind of really I want to use the term blockheaded. And then, okay, I'm going to do tremolo for 2 bars, and then I'm going to go over to pizzicatos, because it's a pain in the ass to change back and forth between them if you're going to use key
Yeah.
switches or whatever. So it kind of limits your thinking and how you're going to put it down, I would think, in comparison to just writing it by hand and saying, okay, I want to do a glissando here, and then I want to have them hit a pizzicato, or staccato hit here, and then switch to pizzicatos or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, that's true. And I think, at least for me, I do have that problem. I don't see it as a problem necessarily. So I think when I'm writing with the paper, I tend to use more changes of articulation, let's say. So I would come up with phrases which are, legato, staccato, and change a lot. And when I'm writing with the DAW, I don't. I think on the one hand, that is, something where if you restrict yourself to some choices, it also forces you to be creative with the elements that you have.
Yeah.
So that's not necessarily a bad thing. So when I'm writing with the DAW, I will probably use this thing where I stick more to longer articulations for a time, and then I use staccato for quite some time, and things like that. But I also think it's good to be able to do the other thing as well, even if it's hard, like really practicing with the mockups and being able to create a realistic phrase that it's mixing staccato and legato and all these things. It's hard and it takes a lot of time, but I think if you are really good with that, it can really add up to that, because in my experiences, maybe for some parts it's not important, because if you have a lot of instruments, you can use also these techniques of layering, for example. So maybe you have a lot of patches for the strings, and maybe you're mixing staccato and legato and everything and achieving all these effects. But then if at any point you have a solo instrument and you want that to be, at the front, and you want that to be really expressive, that's a place where maybe you will spend that time and the effort into making this, phrase sound beautiful. And then in the other parts, it's more like, okay, you now just play, uh, and let it sound all staccato, for example, or something like that. But yeah, I think it's a completely different mindset for me writing for a mock-up than writing for a live instrument, right? Because they are, for me, it's like they are different instruments, right? If I see the DAW with all the virtual libraries as one instrument, and it's kind of like learning how to play a different instrument, like you maybe know how to play guitar and then you pick up the bass. Yeah, it's similar, but it has its other characteristics that you need to spend some time learning. I think with this is the same. You know how to play the keyboard, but this is another instrument, right? It's not a keyboard, so you have to learn how to use it.
Well, and I like, I'll just give you an example. I like to do, I will use a live instrument to inspire what I'm going to put in and program. So for example, I'll give two examples. One, like if I'm doing a kind of a funky thing, I can play the bass, but I'm not necessarily a really skilled bass player to play it all the way through and have it be perfect enough that I don't have to ding around with editing, and and it'll take more time. So I'll figure out the parts that feel right on a bass, because they have to feel right on the instrument and get the articulations the way I want. But it's faster for me to actually program that in most of the time with the libraries that I have. Another example is I was working on a Native American flute type of piece, or it called for that, and I didn't have. I found some libraries that work, but to figure out what I wanted to do for the piece, I played the flute, and I went through the flute, and I went, okay, this is a pentatonic scale basically, but this flute is that I have behind me is so out of tune compared to playing it. It wouldn't jive with everything else that I'm doing, but that was the foundation, playing that in. And I think a lot of composers that we have, like, look at you, you've got all these different musical instruments around. You're probably not a virtuoso at all of them, but when you come to write a part for it, you're going to get your ideas and your inspiration and those kinds of things. Which brings me to, what the heck is that 5-string instrument hanging on the wall back there? That's really interesting. You got to tell me the story about that.
This is a
Yes.
charango. It's an instrument from like the north of Argentina and Bolivia and all these parts. It actually has 10 strings.
Oh,
So
I see that now.
yeah,
Beautiful.
like each string is a double. So some are unison and some are octaves. Like this one, I think it's a little bit out of tune, but you have this, like, it's very similar to the ukulele, but it has like one more string, and then each string is double. So yeah.
Wow, very cool. And I see you have a tuner on there. Anytime I see like more than four strings, I go, oh, there's a challenge keeping it in tune.
Yeah. Yeah, I think all these, I also have a 12 string guitar here, and
Yeah,
yeah, it's like double
challenge.
the effort to
Yeah,
tune it.
give me an hour to tune it, and then we'll be good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, but it's not as bad as tuning a piano.
well, that's true. Well, I interviewed Amelia last week, and she's a very skilled piano tuner technician as part of.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
And I always had old junker pianos, so I'd have a key around and I'd have to I'd fake it, but there was always a couple stinkers, and there's you throw the goop in, you hammer it a little bit, and I mean, but it's tough. It's really hard because
yeah, yeah,
when you're with all that tension, and this is true with guitars too, with that tension you adjust one and it adjusts everything in the entire instrument. So
yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah,
that knowing how to adjust for that or accommodate for that would be a challenge.
yeah, yeah.
I don't want to run out of time and find out your journey story. So like when you were like, did you start like, Bach or Beethoven when you were like 4 and you were a
You
prodigy?
know,
How did you get into music and what inspired you to keep going? And along that path, you become a computer programmer, and that's kind of like part of your day gig.
yeah.
So I want you to take me from the beginning and how that all kind of dovetailed together to where you are today.
Yeah, that's a long story, but I think when I was a kid, I always enjoyed classical music. So I remember my parents had some, CDs of I don't know, some Beethoven symphonies and Chopin and things like that, and I liked those as a kid. But then I also like, all sorts of music. My mother had a guitar at home, and she tried to play it, but she stopped for some time, so it was just a guitar there somewhere in the house. And I remember always wanted to play it, and she wouldn't let me because I was like, I don't know, 6 7 years. So I remember once with my sister we picked it up and we broke it. So she was like, oh, you cannot play with this anymore, it's not a toy. And then I started asking her, "Hey, I wanna learn, so take me to lessons, something." So she found a teacher there, and I started playing.
Was this
Uh,
playing guitar at that point?
yeah, so
You're playing
classical
guitar.
guitar, like the nylon string guitar, the Spanish
Mhm.
guitar, and I was, yeah, probably around 8 years old. And but I wasn't very serious with it. I just went to this teacher, and he would teach me how to read music and some finger exercises and maybe some very easy pieces. And then I continued doing that. I learned some classical pieces, like things from different composers. And then at some point, I also started liking the idea of the piano, because my grandma had a piano in her house, and I also had a really small toy piano that I learned how to play. And then I started learning the piano. So I remember I asked my dad for to buy me a piano that was because the toy one I had, it was like 2 octaves, and really small keys. And then I had one that was a Yamaha, but it's like probably around 4 6
63 or
octaves.
68 or
Yeah,
something. Yeah.
yeah, so one of those, but it wasn't sensitive or anything. And I remember, because I knew how to read music from the guitar, I printed some scores for, like, I don't know, I think Bach Prelude number 1, these kind of pieces that I liked, and I learned how to play those. So then I learned really fast, and I also learned, I think, Chopin Nocturne, Opus 9 number 2, the famous one. And then I said, okay, I want to get more serious with this, and I asked my dad to buy this piano that I have here right now. So it's like a Yamaha with 88 keys. It's
Oh,
that this
nice.
so
With the
he bought me,
weighted action, right?
yeah, with 80 action, everything. He bought me this one, and I stopped playing for like 2 years or something. So he was really mad, like, oh, I spent all this money in the piano and now you're not playing. And then the there was this swine flu thing in, I think it was 2008 or something. And I remember I was with some friends, and we didn't have, I was in high school at that moment. We didn't have a school for like a month or something, because it was like a pandemic, right? So I was at my home, and a week before that, I got together with a friend, and he was playing, I think, the Turkish March and some sonata by Beethoven. And I said, oh, I really want to learn this. So I remember those 30 days of like I didn't have to go to school. I just printed the score, and I started practicing like 8 hours per day. And
Yeah.
I got,
Awesome.
to play that. And I say, okay, now I'm going to sign up for the conservatory and get more serious with this. So I did. I had to wait, I think, 1 year, because they always start at the beginning of the year. And yeah, after that, I got more serious into studying, theory and playing and all that. But also I had a band, so I was playing guitar. I stopped going to lessons actually with that swine flu thing. I called my teacher, hey, I'm going to come back after this, and I never did. But I was playing with some friends. I actually started playing electric guitar. I didn't know how to use a pick, so I was playing with my fingers at first, and then learned how to use a pick and everything. I was playing in some rock bands. I really liked heavy metal at the time, so I bought a 7-string guitar that is somewhere over
The
there.
power chords.
Uh, so yeah, I started like shredding and all that. I wasn't really good at it, but a little bit. And then yeah, I was then playing the piano more than the guitar. And at some point, I think when I finished high school, I started studying electronic engineering. So at that point, as I mentioned, it became quite a challenge for me to do both things at the same time. So I prioritized the engineering part, but I kept studying piano and everything. But it just meant that for me it was
Less
slower.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe that I think they make you learn all these etudes and then sonatas and really long pieces and things like that. So for me, it was challenging to do that in 1 year. So sometimes I took like a year and a half or 2 years for the academic year, let's say. But yeah, I did that, and then I graduated from engineering, and then I started working in software. So kind of like pivoted to that. At some point, I got the job offer to move to the UK, and that's why I came here. And eventually, I was able to bring this keyboard with me and some of my guitars. And yeah, then as I already said, I started getting more into composing. So yeah, funny story about that. When I was probably yeah when I was in high school, but I don't know which year, but probably yeah around 2008 also. I remember I wanted to get into like recording stuff at home, and I actually learned how to use a sonar. And
Which DAW do you use, by the way, right now? And which one
right
did you
now I'm using Reaper. uh
Reaper? Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, back then I learned how to use Sonar. I remember I was having a lot of issues with latency and everything. So imagine I didn't know anything. I just went to a studio with my band to record the demo, and I saw the guy there was using Sonar. So I asked him, "Hey, what are you using to record?" "Oh, this." So I just went, got the program, but I didn't know how to use it. So I was, just clicking buttons and learning this. And at some point, I remember I found this library, which is East West, and it was
Yeah.
like 100 gigabytes of. I remember back then, my computer didn't have enough space, so I was like a month downloading everything into DVDs, and then learning how to use it was a nightmare. But I remember I composed like a really small orchestral piece. But yeah, after that, I thought it was too hard, so I stopped doing that and I focused more on playing. But I don't know, like 12 years later or what, like 14 years later, I started doing the same. So I always wonder, hey, what would have happened, if I kept trying that? Uh, Probably I would be better at that by now, but yeah.
Yeah, but the skills that you learn playing piano, they're probably more valuable in the end game because the
Yeah.
technologies have changed and they continue to change. I wanted to let you know, if you don't know, and I'll hook up with you afterwards. They actually have a library of toy piano. That little toy piano you're used to.
Yeah.
I'll connect you with it so you can keep your chops up, right?
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, no, and I think it's actually cool to do all those things. I actually have this hand drum, the small one,
Yep.
like a steel drum. I made my own virtual instrument of that.
Do you have this? You said the steel drum.
Yeah,
Which
it's
one do you have?
let me show you. It's a small one. It's not really good, but I think it's useful. And again, it's easier for me to play the piano, so I record
Oh,
it.
those, I want to get one of those. Those are so cool. Those
Yeah,
are really beautiful. Yeah, that's
yeah,
beautiful. There's a couple different variations of that. That's really
yeah.
neat.
This is a small one because I don't have a lot of space, but yeah, there are bigger ones. But I remember I wanted to play something, and it was like, okay, I have to learn how to play it. And I thought maybe I could just create a virtual instrument and play it on the piano, and that's what I did. So yeah,
Well, I went and got a tuned chromatic kalimba. I've got
yeah,
simple little kalimbas, right? I've got the like the this kind of version, right?
yeah,
Small. It's its own little thing, and that's cool. Just play the rhythm. Well, I thought, okay, I'll get one of these, and then I can play. I can take what I learned on the piano. And I'm like, oh my god, it's a whole different world. It's beautiful, and it's a little thing. But one of the things this little instrument that you have there, the beautiful thing about it, I get, I'm a professional composer. I compose music all day long, but I was realizing, and I have to practice the various instruments and that sort of thing. But I was realizing, I hadn't taken the time to just sit down and have fun
yeah,
being like, and that's what an instrument like that'll be really cool for. And I just like, kind of like it was kind of my escape to sit there and play with the kalimba. And I'd have to say I sucked pretty bad, even though there was some musicality out of it. But I'm like, just trying to figure it out. It's like it's a whole different. You get into a little space, and then you can write something for that. But then to translate that over to whatever you're doing is, so it's just like find ways of take a new instrument and being able to have fun with it. That's what I think is important that we do as composers, and is just stepping out of this. I've got to write a piece for this, or I've got to just being able to. Not that what we do isn't fun and enjoyable, or we wouldn't do it, but just for the sake of doing it, it doesn't need to be for a project or anything. Just
yeah,
letting go
yeah.
and
No,
finding that little zone.
yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's so two things. One is it gets you in this flow of thinking from the instrument, which, each instrument is different. And I sometimes do that, with open tunings in the guitar, which
Mhm.
maybe, you come up with ideas that are new because, you play a shape and now it's, something different.
Mhm.
But then, yeah, I think it's you can come up with some ideas that maybe are something new that you wouldn't come up if you just are in your main instrument, if it's piano or whatever. And then the other thing that you mentioned before, and I also wanted to say, is that, for example, I have also a violin, and I suck at playing the violin, right? It sounds awful, but it's important with this thing you said earlier about knowing how to write for the instrument, which I think is
Absolutely.
also another important point of what we were saying before, which is if you might only write for the DAW, and that's fine. If no one is ever going to play that, that's fine. You can write something that's unplayable and it sounds good, and that's fine. But if you really want people to play it, you know, it's good to understand how that instrument works. Because, for example, there are some things that a violin can't play that you can do in the piano, or the harp is a really good example, right? Like you could write a chromatic scale on the harp, and then that person can't play it. So like
It's tough. Yeah.
understanding how the instruments work and how to write for the instruments, I think it's also really important if you plan to have your music performed
Well,
by
harp
people.
chromatic is easy. Glissando.
Yeah.
But yeah, but to
But
pluck
yeah,
it,
you have
or
to
whatever. Yeah,
tune
yeah.
it Yeah. So you don't have like 12 notes to choose from at all
Well, yeah,
times.
and
Yeah.
and that and for me, and I need to kind of remember this, but that you have different pedals, and the
Yeah.
different pedals are kind of like a capo
Yeah.
for
The
guitar,
way I think
but
it
it's
is,
changing the tuning.
the
If I
way I'm
recall,
thinking
it's like,
is you have the white keys of the piano, and for each key, you can decide if you move it one step up or one step down. So that's the things that you can play with the harp. So
yeah.
like if you want, you can say, oh, now G is G sharp, and you have that. But it's like you cannot have C sharp, D sharp, and E, like, because you don't have enough strings for that. But
The
yeah,
tuning. Well, and then there's different kinds of harps too. Some are
yeah,
than
that,
others
yeah,
and different. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So that,
yeah.
but
But
that's a great example.
it's a whole new world about learning about these instruments and all that. And I'm by no means an expert, but it's I think the more you learn about this, the more you understand as well why the music also evolved like this, the orchestral music, and why some things, maybe that you can write for an orchestra in the piano, then, when you want the orchestra to play, you have to make a lot of decisions on what to do with things. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting world, like orchestration in itself. But yeah, for me, it's very important as a composer to always be learning more about that.
Yeah, well, back in the 80s, in my first music career before I retired, I used to do a lot of soundtracks for corporate videos and stuff like that. And what I found is the rule, and the samples were nowhere near as good as they are now.
Yeah.
There were night and day difference. 20 years does amazing things. But they had some pretty interesting, pads and things that I could do and programming it. But I always found the key to making it feel like real music was always having at least one live instrument. So if
Yeah.
it was a little groove thing, I'd have a saxophone, or I think there were some popular singers that they sang on top of their tracks, and because they were really fluid singers and the background vocals, you didn't really notice it. The tracks were accompanying them and you were fine with it. But that whole key of have a violin, have a guitar, have something that's a live instrument, and it would compensate for where you didn't have that kind of live feel, if you will, with a sequenced type of underscore.
Yeah.
So I think that is true today, in that quite often a lot of these scores that are done, it seems that if they're going to have live musicians put on top of it, they're going to have a horn section or a string section or woodwind section, and they're probably going to blend them with what you've done in your DAW, because they're going along with a click, and you're going to have any of your tempo changes and those kinds of things going along with a click. They're going to play along with it, and it's just going to add that life to what you're doing. I mean, you should be making your mock-ups, I assume, to sound good anyways without that. But I would think that a lot of these hybrids and scores are that where they do have the luxury of live musicians, they're going to blend it with some of the things that you've already put together, because you can't
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
you
There
can't
were.
you can't implement some of the hybrid sounds with a real orchestra. It's just a different world.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating world as well. And in this recording experience we had in Momentum, there were some people that did that. So they went to the recording session with a mock-up that maybe, for example, had percussion or some synths, and then the musicians in the orchestra are recording, but they are also listening to the mock-up,
Yep.
which I think that's the best way of doing it, because you make them blend with the mock-up.
Yep.
Whereas if you maybe try to add the instruments later,
Yeah.
you have some issues with the tuning and all these things. But yeah, it's a very interesting experience, at least for me when I'm at home. Maybe, yeah, I try to do that. If it's something that I can play in one of my instruments, I will try to add that. I always like to add some guitars or some element that's played to the things that I write, and then maybe you can get a session player to maybe add one layer of violin or cello to your music, and that
Just to
really
get that
sounds.
extra expression
Yeah,
in there. Yeah, that's a really
yeah,
good thing. Yeah, the last couple of years, I built 3 studios. This is my third in the last 3 years, and then had to move around a bit. So I've always been like, okay, I'm getting ready to, be able to then work with more live musicians, and then I'm like, got to move by the time I get it set up. So I've been in transition so much. I so miss that
yeah.
playing and interacting with live musicians. Which, by the way, you're wearing a gig salad t-shirt that I
Oh
think
yeah.
you got that at Taxi, I bet.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
now
that's
have
true.
you, that's one of those online portals for people that don't know. I think it's just gigsalad.com, and you can connect with that, and people are saying, hey, I need a vocalist, or I need a violin player, or whatever, and you interact and make a connection and share your files, and then pass back basically wave or AIF files, and then sync them with your piece, and people put those things together for various recording sessions or collaborations. um, and so have you worked with them at all?
No, not really. I have this T-shirt from the jam session that we played in
Yeah, that
Taxi,
was
but
a good
yeah,
time.
I've heard it. Yeah, I want to do that thing as well. So yeah, I only miss, as you said, working with people. And I think here for me, it's also hard, to record. So I'm kind of like in a space where I also have the kitchen back there and other stuff. So guitar is easy because you just plug it in, if it's electric or something. But
Yeah.
when you have to start dealing with microphones, so I actually have a dynamic microphone that I use because I also have a condenser, but it's so sensitive that I don't know, it picks up, the fridge, the
Yeah.
heating, so many noises around that I think, in,
You
in, a,
know,
in a kind of setup, you can't really use it. But yeah.
so in building these various studios over the last couple years, every single studio has something about it. No matter how many baffles you put in or whatever, there's always going to be a sound that drives you nuts. You know,
Yeah.
so in COVID, I was in my house, and every time I'm right next to the furnace. Be great. I had a nice little setup, but every time the furnace kicked in, I'm listening to it, and that's the same problem I have here. Is this is a small space, and when the furnace kicks in, there's no way to get around that, you
Yeah.
know. But for the rest of the time, it's beautiful. But I've really uh figure out a way to ignore that, and then I use good headphones. But
Yeah.
the difference with headphones, for example, that I find, and I don't know if you find this, is you're really it's not the same ambience that you're getting when you're listening to a room.
Yeah.
And that's why things like the Stephen Slate, his headphones are emulating rooms, but you still have that separation that's absolute left and right.
Yeah.
And when you're hearing you're hearing a combination of sounds. Like, for
Yeah.
example, in here, I have a bookshelf over to the left, and I have to sit in a particular way. Otherwise, it captures. It's like a little bass cat, and it messes with my ears. So, even though I've got good speakers and a lot of sound dampening and that sort of thing, I can get a pretty good mix if I wanted to here. But you know, headphones is really, if you want to be able to have a consistent space that you work in, and you're working in a variety of different studios, like you travel a lot. And if I travel to Brazil, my wife's there, I'm going to the Dominican Republic next week, yay. If I take something with to work on, having that consistent headphone that you're really comfortable with, I think is really important for folks to consider.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I think for me, I like to use both. So when I'm working with a mix, I will switch from headphones to speakers and kind of like compare, because I think, yeah, I like my headphones. They're really good, but I think, as you said, this kind of space, and sometimes you can have these illusions where maybe you're listening to something and then you listen to it in the speakers and it sounds different. So I think that's at least for me, that my room is not treated and all that. I always need to use headphones to make sure that um uh I'm not making some kind of like mistake by the thing of the room. But I also want to double check, and I think I usually good mixes, they sound well in any kind of setup. And that's why also using references is so important, because I think also the human ear is so adaptable that if you are in a space, you will adapt to it really fast. So I think that's why also switching to like you are mixing, if you are doing that for hours, at some point your ears start getting used to those imbalances.
Yep.
And then it's like you have to take a break, listen to something else, and then come in, and then you say, oh, why is this so bright or so dark, or why is it so much reverb, these kind of things that sometimes you just learn to ignore. um but yeah, for me that is something that I wish someday I could have my own space and treat it acoustically and all that, so that I can have a better mix. I actually, funny story, uh I went to Paris to a masterclass with Alan Meyerson, who is like the mix engineer for Hans Zimmer.
Oh yeah.
uh, yeah, he showed us in a very like in a new studio there in Paris, the some of the mixes of Dune, and some I think part of like the Pirates of the Caribbean and some other
No, they're
soundtracks.
mixing it. Are they mixing in Adobe surround?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. That's
yeah,
a
yeah, and that
5 point or
was
7 point, 5, 7, or
uh,
9,
7.
7.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, that was a crazy experience, and I think after that I said, wow, I don't really have any setup that can reproduce this kind of fidelity. So it was a very eye-opening experience, and also a little sad for me, because it was like yeah, I probably
Yeah,
will never
what do you,
have
that's my
this kind of,
competition. I gotta,
yeah.
that's a high
But
bar.
for me, for example, I realized, hey, I need a subwoofer, because there are so many things that go into the low end of the mix that I'm not even able to hear, because my speakers won't reproduce, I don't know, 80 hertz. It's like this kind of thing. So I started paying more attention to that after this experience,
Mhm.
which at least for me it was, I think, better. There are some plugins also that maybe correct some of the imbalances of your room, but they can't do magic, right? But at least for some of the attenuation that you might have in some frequencies, or maybe the opposite, you might have certain frequency that's boosted by your room. I think with these kind of things, they really help. So yeah, I try to put my monitors in a good spot, and then measure it, and then try to put something to absorb a little bit of the sound. But yeah, it's challenging, because also like I'm renting this space, so I cannot like drill the walls to put something. So yeah, it's a whole process of adapting to the environment. But yeah.
Yeah, I hear that. Well, like, for example, one of the things that I've noticed is that, so I use these are like my go-to headphones. It's the Apple AirPod or AirPods Pro,
Mm.
whatever. And what I noticed in there, they're pretty full, and they've got this noise cancellation, which is really nice. But they don't have the same level of high end that
Mm.
I get off of anything over in here. So when I'm mixing, I have to make sure that there's enough high end that it doesn't sound like crap on there. That at the same time, and I'll hear plenty of good low end and that sort of thing in there. But then when I hear it, just on the iPhone, there's no low end, right? Or very, very, you
Yeah.
can't hear those, a lot of the subtle little things. Um, so it's always that balance of making sure that it sounds acceptable on a variety of devices. Even though it's not going to sound the same, you're going to have enough of the right frequencies, and there's enough separation. You're hearing everything clearly. Yeah, I tell you that the engineering part is something that people don't they take for granted. It's
Yeah,
it's really a skill and a whole step. And when I put together a piece, I'll spend, say, a whole day working on it or whatever, and I think I'll have a good mix. I'll take it and I'll listen to it overnight, and then come back the next day and kind of do tweaks on it. But you could easily spend, just like you could spend a day or two, several days, just working on the mix, just getting your alternate stuff together. So yeah, that's, I mean, there's a reason why there's a job role
yeah,
as engineer. Unfortunately, as cinematic composers, we have to wear so many hats. We
yeah.
have to be a pseudo engineer and pseudo violinist and pseudo flautist, and we've got to kind of be a little bit of everybody in order to get our ideas captured, with the right effect and intensity and emotion and so forth. So
Yeah, yeah, no, that's so true. I think it's good to have, this broad skill set. In the end, I think sometimes, you might end up being lucky and you have another person mixing your music. But if you don't, you need to be good enough that, it won't sound like crap and you will be able
exactly.
to, convey your idea and all that. So, yeah, I think it's important, to have this knowledge of the things. And I think at some point it's overwhelming. So that's why it's also good to, learn something and then maybe practice it and all that. And eventually, with time, you're keep getting better at these things. But at least for me, this it's always, you're learning something new about the mix. But as you said, it's so important to try it in different places, and maybe wait some time. And for me, this trick of using references is also really helpful because you listen to music here in your own speakers and you compare, with something that sounds similar, and you will detect, right away if it's too bright or too dark, or the why do these strings sound like this for this piece, and in my piece they sound like very different. So what is it? And
Or
I find
especially if you're trying to do like retro kinds of music, like the
yeah,
recording techniques of the Beatles in the 70s and Motown is completely different than the way it is
yeah,
now. So if you're trying to emulate something in a particular style of a big band jazz, or anything that's in a period piece, capturing and being able to engineer it so it sounds like it's from that era, that's a real skill set.
yeah. Yeah, but at least for me, I try to always use my ears and try to do this thing as close as I can. And then I rely on the tricks and the plugins and all that. But I think a mistake that I used to make, at the beginning is focusing too much on the tricks and the plugins. And it's like, oh, this will solve all your problems. And I think it's very different. Like each piece is unique, each mix is unique. So if you don't know the first principles and don't have good ears and know how to solve things, I think if you're just relying on the tricks, for example, for me it was, oh, I will always put the compressor and do this, and it's like, why are you doing it? I don't know. I watched on some tutorial that I have to compress everything, and my mixes weren't sounding good. And then at some point it was like I learned more about the compressor and I learned how to listen to it, and now it's like, does it really need compression, right? Do I really need to do it? And I use more my ears than just relying on these tricks, and I think I have gotten better after this. But yeah, I think that's a skill that's very important, but it also takes time, right? So for me, a lot of these things I realize now, it's like you don't listen to music in the same way once you understand all these things, right? So before
Yep.
it was like, hey, I was listening, and I realized actually when I'm listening to maybe an album that I haven't listened in 10 years, right? And I hear completely different things right now because it's like, oh,
Exactly.
you hear all these production things that maybe when I was a kid I was just listening to the music, maybe the chords, but not at all like anything related to the mixing or all that. And now I'm listening and it's, oh, this is interesting. So yeah, I
It's
think
it's cute. It's interesting how we listen in various layers, the same way that we orchestrate in layers, and everything's in layers, and you're not always hearing everything at the same time. So that's a really good, really key point.
Yeah,
Well, some people could watch a movie and then they get something new out of it every time because there's usually so much there,
yeah,
in the story or the nuance or that little giveaway, type of thing that they would have set up there. You missed it the first time, so
yeah.
you were surprised, but they told you it was coming, but you see it the
But
second time.
but also I think my sister, she's like she makes movies and all that, and she studied cinema, and I think now I have a lot of more knowledge because of her. But I remember at the beginning when she was studying, we were watching the same movie, and she was like focusing on completely different stuff, right? I was focusing on, hey, I follow the story, the characters, and she was focusing, oh, you know what? Look what they did with the camera here, and this movement, and this change of zoom, and it was like, why are you like focusing on that, right? So I think with music is the same. Maybe a person is listening to the music and they're saying, oh, I like the voice of the singer. And for me, when I was a teenager, I was only listening to the guitar and the drums,
Yeah,
right? And for me the singer was like
they
secondary.
were there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then now I'm more focused on the composition side of things and the production, so I listen a lot to like mix and the panning and the different levels of things and all the effects, the reverbs, all these kind of things. And I think it's, yeah, so true, like what you focus on is also changing how you hear things. So yeah, it's a very interesting, and that's why I think it's also so subjective, right? Like and at least for me it's also a good learning experience, because now it doesn't matter what I'm listening to, I always try to find that element that I can enjoy, even if I'm listening to music that maybe I don't necessarily like or want to listen to. I'm always looking for that, and I think it's a very interesting way of uh, enjoying more types of music that maybe you don't normally listen to.
Yeah. So, uh, as advice to other composers that are thinking of getting into this realm of, writing classical types of music or modern cinematic types of composing, what advice would you give to other folks that are composers, to help them find their way on their journey, uh, and leverage their skills to the best they can?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, I would say the first thing is to start with what you are already good at and try to build from that, because it's something that requires constant practice and building that momentum, right? So if you are maybe not good at mixing and you start focusing on that, and maybe you will get discouraged, but if you already can play the piano, start there and build from that. Because I think for me the most important part is just get this going. So be writing consistently, being producing music consistently. So that's the first step. Then it's like you are constantly needing to learn these things, and as I said, it's overwhelming. So start little by little, and you learn a little bit about mixing one day, a little bit about orchestration and that. And then I say, it's, so at least for me, very important to try things and maybe try to copy, as much as you can. So for example, for me, I listen to a piece of classical music that I like. I go, I look for the score. I try to see, oh, what did the composer do here? What does it sound this way? What chords is he using? What kind of instrumentation is he using? Why is he using this combination of bassoon and French horn and clarinet? And how does it sound? And slowly with these kind of things, you will start building, this experience and your ears and the theory and all that. But I say it's more like a game for me, so you have to take it in this way, and I think naturally this leads to you getting better with time and learning. So yeah.
Well, that's great advice. One of the things that, I've always found and respect the most. I mean, it's hard. You can't get an ego when you're focused on like, oh my God, there's so much I have to learn. I'm like,
Mm.
I might be here, somebody else might be there, somebody else is over here, somebody else is way up here. Jacob Collier way up here.
Yeah.
Is he gonna pick some, Quincy Jones way up here. Pick your engineers or whoever, whatever. And it's like there's always so much to learn, and that's one of the fascinating things that's exciting about about this whole journey in music is that there's so much to learn. So I think that's great advice that you've given. I really appreciate you sharing your afternoon or evening here with me, and your journey and your story. I look forward to learning more. You're writing a piece of music or a piece of software at some point that is going to help as a learning tool for folks that are maybe more classically oriented to kind of free their mindset to be able to be more improvisational and open to ideas and feel more comfortable with that whole process. So I look forward to that. That'll be a whole nother interview when we dig
Yeah.
into that. You interviewed me as part of your one of your guinea pigs in the subject last week or so, and
Yeah.
I look forward to that coming out. What's the name? Do you have a name for that project when you?
Not yet. I'm thinking about music craft, but I don't know. It
It's a
might change.
cool idea. You have a great
Yeah.
concept, and when you get that together, we're going to interview you again. Thanks again for joining us, Julian Mateu, very talented composer. Look in the comments below, and you're going to find information about we're going to have a website, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
And share that with folks right now. What is that?
So the website is jmateu, like mateu.co.uk. And yeah, I'm on like all the social networks as Julian Mateu. So
Awesome. So go find his music. It's great stuff. I hope you're going to share with me the link to the piece that you recorded with the orchestra. I'd love to
yeah,
hear.
yeah, I
And
have
thank
a
you
YouTube
all.
video for that. So yeah,
Thank you all for joining us here and spending your time learning about this man's great adventure in music. And we'll see you on the next one. Always end on a high note and stay sharp.